War is often remembered by its victories and surrenders, but history rarely ends as neatly as it does in textbooks. Some armies don't vanish in an instant, they dissolve into chaos. Some people walk away from war not as prisoners or defeated enemies, but as shadows, nameless, without records, without a trace. After May 1945, tens of thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers fell into that void. Where did they go? Who was brought to justice? Who disappeared? And why did it take decades for justice to finally catch up? If you want to understand history, not just by what concluded, but by what was buried behind the silence, subscribe to History War, because some stories only begin when the gunfire has stopped. May of 1945 didn't arrive like a sudden explosion, but like a long-held breath, finally exhaled after 6 relentless years. In Paris, London, and Rome, crowds flooded the streets, church bells rang out. Newspapers rushed to print the headline, "Unconditional Surrender." For most of Europe, the war had ended with a definitive full stop. But in other places, in the forests of Central Europe, on the muddy roads leading west, in bombed-out cities that hadn't yet received the news, the war did not end. It merely changed form. For those who had once worn the insignia of the Waffen-SS, that moment brought no relief, only a cold void. A structure built on absolute loyalty vanished from the legal world within hours. There was no formal dissolution, no demobilization orders, no state stepping forward to claim responsibility for those who had fought in its name. There was only a harsh, new reality. These soldiers woke up in a world where they no longer belonged to any structure, and the name they carried was now synonymous with criminality. On that night of transition, tens of thousands were cast out of the normal flow of history. They were no longer soldiers, but not yet prisoners. They weren't protected by the laws of war, but hadn't been tried by any court. In between those states lay a dangerous gray zone, where survival depended on mercilessly small details. Were you in the East or the West? Who stood before you? Did they have the time or the will to tell you apart from someone else? In the East, such distinctions barely existed. The Red Army advanced with fresh memories of scorched villages and erased families. To them, the SS insignia, Waffen or otherwise, was evidence enough. Executions were carried out silently by the roadside or behind abandoned warehouses. Prisoner columns were marched toward the rising sun, toward labor camps that dotted the Siberian map like black marks. For many, it was an end without gravestones. In the West, the picture was more complex. The American and British armies maintained legal procedures: disarmament, detention, interrogation, classification. But from the outset, the verdict had already been written. The Waffen-SS was not seen as a regular military force, but as the armed wing of a criminal ideology. That meant every individual, even those never accused specific crimes, entered the queue of suspicion. Names were recorded, faces photographed, questions asked over and over, not to uncover truth, but to catch contradictions. In the hastily built temporary camps, thousands lay on damp ground, staring up at canvas ceilings, realizing that for them the war wasn't over. It had merely shifted from artillery blasts to the footsteps of guards, from tactical maps to personal files. And in that waiting time, a quiet thought spread. If they could shed this identity, if they could avoid being recognized, the door to survival might still be ajar. But not everyone had the chance to think. In the final hours of the war, before the surrender had reached the front lines, many Waffen-SS units were still fighting, not out of blind faith in victory, but because they didn't know where or how to stop. The chain of command, once held together by strict discipline and clear orders, had unraveled too quickly. If any orders did come, they were often contradictory. Retreat to where? Surrender to whom? Hold your weapon or toss it aside. This unraveling didn't happen in a flash, but like a fabric stretched until it tore. Divisions once hailed as symbols of strength became nothing more than names on paper. On the ground, they splintered into groups of a few dozen, then a few, and finally into lone individuals navigating the chaos. There were no more flags to rally behind, no reliable radio frequencies. Every decision, advance or stop, fire or raise your hands, had to be made alone. In these retreats, the instinct to survive gradually replaced all ideology. Those trained to march forward without hesitation now learned to hide, to evade, to blend in with refugees. Uniform jackets were turned inside out, helmets discarded into ditches. Rifles once meticulously maintained were hastily buried under tree roots. Every item left behind was a piece of the person they once were, and a step further from the name that could now get them killed. And yet, not everyone could disappear. Some marks were not so easily erased. Some memories wouldn't let a man simply step into another role. And above all, there were places where time itself seemed to pause, waiting for them. Besieged cities, final front lines where retreat was no longer an option. It was in that space, where war had ended on paper but raged on in every individual decision, that the fate of the Waffen-SS entered a new phase. No longer the story of a single organization, but hundreds of fractured stories, each beginning at the same breaking point, the collapse of the structure that once held them together. And from that collapse, the shards began to show. Elite divisions once feared and glorified now slipping into chaos, leaving behind not victory or defeat, but a void where power, discipline, and belief all vanished at once. The collapse of the Waffen-SS didn't unfold like a wall being smashed by a single decisive blow. It was more like a structure rotting from within. When the final pressure arrived, every joint cracked at once. By late April 1945, many divisions still appeared in full form on Nazi Germany's operational maps, still marked by names, numbers, and defensive positions. But on the ground, those markings were illusions. The units no longer existed in any military sense. They survived only as scattered armed groups driven by one shared instinct: escape the tightening spiral. The chain of command, once the force that made the Waffen-SS so fearsome, disintegrated so rapidly that no one fully grasped it was gone. Division headquarters lost contact with regiments. Regiments were cut off from battalions. Orders arrived late to the wrong units or contradicted each other. Some were told to launch counterattacks while neighboring forces had already been ordered to retreat. Some were commanded to hold at all costs, even though that position had fallen hours earlier. In this chaos, discipline didn't vanish instantly, but it lost its anchor. And when orders lost meaning, the soldier was forced to decide for himself. Nordland was a textbook case of that unraveling. Once built as the pride of Northern European volunteers, hailed for its fierce combat reputation, by the end of April 1945, the division was nothing but shattered fragments. Its numbers had shrunk to the point where a division on paper was the size of a reinforced battalion in reality. If any tanks remained, they could be counted on one hand. Headquarters had moved from reinforced bunkers to subway stations, basement apartments, any place solid enough to dodge artillery fire. Tactical maps were taped to moldy brick walls. Arrows drawn for counterattacks everyone knew were only buying hours, maybe days, no more. Elsewhere, Charlemagne dissolved so quickly it barely left a trace. Just weeks earlier, it had existed as a division of more than 7,000 men, French volunteers who had chosen to fight for Nazi Germany. But pressure from collapsing fronts and the breakdown of all logistics tore it apart. Small groups splintered off, lost contact, and were swallowed into the chaotic tide of retreat. When the survivors decided to head for Berlin, their numbers had dwindled to a few hundred. By any standard, they were no longer a division. When they reached the dying capital, they weren't even seen as a distinct unit, just fragments absorbed into the city's patchwork defenses. The names that once spread fear across so many fronts, Totenkopf, Leibstandarte, Hitlerjugend, were not spared the same fate. Coordinated attacks were a thing of the past. Formations were broken. They now fought as rearguard groups clinging to villages, patches of forest, with one stark, simple goal: clear a path westward. Not to continue fighting, but to avoid falling into Soviet hands. It wasn't cowardice. It was a cold calculation. The East meant forced labor or death without trial. The West, though it meant captivity, still held the possibility of survival. In those final days, the idea of an elite division became hollow. Elite was no longer defined by offensive strength or strict discipline, but by the ability to adapt to collapse. The survivors were usually those who accepted reality the quickest. The war was lost, and the only mission left was to survive. They learned to move in silence, avoid major roads, blend into civilian crowds. They understood that every passing hour, every bridge crossed, every checkpoint evaded was another step further from the identity that could destroy them. Still, not every road led west. Some units, or fragments of them, were caught in tightening encirclements. In some places, geography, enemy speed, and lack of information made retreat impossible. In such cases, the final option was often to head toward the one location still mentioned in scattered orders: Berlin. By late April 1945, the capital of the Third Reich was no longer a seat of power. It was a collapsing symbol. But that's exactly why it became a magnet for the final shards of the Waffen-SS. Not out of belief in victory, but because Berlin was the only place where the last remnants knew they'd find comrades, weapons, and some kind of structure, no matter how temporary, to cling to. For many, it was the last gathering point before the end. Small, exhausted, ragged groups marched into the city through cratered roads. They brought with them not just dwindling ammunition, but the weariness of weeks on the run. When they stepped into Berlin, they knew this wasn't a place to survive for long. Yet in that moment, under constant shelling, beneath skies ablaze, the ruined city took on a strange meaning. It was the place where the disintegration reached its end. A place where an army, no longer on paper, no longer in strategy, would die in silence, in scattered groups, street by street, among rubble so complete it blurred the line between battlefield and burial ground. Berlin welcomed the final days of April, not with frantic panic, but with a suffocating heaviness. The city was no longer a capital in any political or administrative sense. It had become a warped space ravaged by shellfire, where time seemed to slow between the screech of artillery and the eerie silences that followed each blast. For the last fragments of the Waffen-SS, Berlin wasn't a destination of hope. It was where they were forced to confront the rawest truth. There was no retreat, no historical role left to play, only the fragile act of surviving hour by hour. In this dying city, war no longer followed the logic of front lines. There were no clear defenses, no rear echelon, no familiar rhythm of advance and withdrawal. Berlin had turned into a shattered maze, where every house might become a temporary fortress, every basement a command post, and every intersection a potential trap. The Waffen-SS units entering the city were no longer divisions, not even regiments. They existed as 10 or 15-man combat groups, hastily assembled from whatever fragments remained, wielding patchwork weapons and operating with near-zero information. They didn't fight to reclaim the city, but to buy time. Every hour they held out was another hour for others to escape, or at least another sliver of distance between the present and the inevitable end. Within that logic, even small actions took on the weight of survival. A single Panzerfaust, fired from a second-story window, could destroy a Soviet tank, forcing the enemy to halt, redeploy, proceed more cautiously. Tactically, it was a success. Strategically, it meant nothing. But in Berlin, where strategy had already died, these moments were what kept a soldier upright. Amid the rubble, names once spoken with reverence inside the Waffen-SS were now little more than symbols. One of those was Henri Fenet, the commander of the last remaining battalion of Charlemagne. Under his leadership, these Frenchmen destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks in brief, brutal street battles, fought at such close quarters that there was no safe distance. These feats lived on in the memories of those who survived, but almost nowhere in official records. By then, the unit Fenet led no longer existed on paper. They fought like ghosts, belonging to no structure long enough to be documented. Berlin consumed all notions of glory. What remained was the repetition of instinct. Move, shoot, hide, wait. By day, artillery shook the last remaining walls. By night, fires lit up the hollow faces caked in dust and smoke. In the rare pauses, one might hear hurried footsteps in basements, whispered orders spoken without certainty, and sometimes the muffled sobs of civilians trapped in the same space as soldiers awaiting death. On April 30th, 1945, news of Adolf Hitler's suicide spread like an underground ripple. There were no loudspeakers, no formal announcements echoing across the city. The news passed from mouth to mouth, in silent glances and pauses longer than normal. For many Waffen-SS soldiers, it wasn't a shock. It was confirmation of what they had long sensed. There was no center left to cling to. Every order after that moment became symbolic. Not because people refused to believe, but because there was no reason to believe anymore. In that void, personal choices began to replace collective orders. Some kept fighting until their ammunition ran dry. Some tried to escape in small groups, slipping away through tunnels and darkness. Some simply laid down their arms and waited, as though exhaustion had overtaken fear. These choices were no longer measured by honor or betrayal. They were measured by a single question: how much longer can I stay alive? Berlin, in its final days, did not end with a decisive battle. It ended with the gradual disappearance of those still holding weapons. As white flags began to appear sporadically, as combat groups lost all contact, the city shifted from a war zone to a space of waiting to see who would arrive first, what sentence would be passed. And in that limbo, many in the Waffen-SS realized that death was no longer the most frightening outcome. What was worse was surviving, only to enter a world that saw them as criminals from the very first moment. As the gunfire faded, Berlin took on the look of a post-war city even before the war had officially ended. The surviving soldiers emerged from the rubble in the posture of absolute defeat. They had no formations, no insignia, no stories left to tell, but they still had their bodies, and that meant another path was beginning. Because for them, leaving Berlin did not mean the war was over. It simply marked a shift into a new phase, where rifles were replaced by barbed wire, battle maps by personal files, and each passing day became a test of whether surrender truly brought an end or merely opened the door to another kind of warfare, quieter, longer, and sometimes just as merciless. When the last gunshots faded and white flags appeared atop the few buildings still standing, many believed the war had ended with a clear and final line. But for those who emerged from the ruins of Berlin, especially the former members of the Waffen-SS, surrender wasn't a stopping point. It was a doorway to another journey, quieter, more uncertain, and far longer than any battle they had ever fought. In the early days of May 1945, surrender unfolded amid chaos. There was no standard protocol, no unified procedure. Some surrendered one by one at makeshift checkpoints. Others were rounded up in parks, public squares, or roadside clearings. Some handed over their weapons to American forces in the morning, only to be transferred to an unfamiliar unit by afternoon. In that disorder, a person's fate could shift within hours, sometimes hinging on a single hasty administrative decision. For many, the moment they laid down arms brought a brief sense of relief. At least they were alive. At least the shelling had stopped. But that feeling was quickly replaced by another reality. They were no longer in control of anything. From the moment they were disarmed, they were swept into a stream of movements, never told the destination. Temporary camps, POW screening stations, field detention zones of barbed wire and canvas tents. Each stop was only a pause, not an end. And every pause carried the fear that the next stop might be worse. The Allies' classification process unfolded in an environment that was nearly impossible to manage. Millions of German POWs, displaced civilians, freed forced laborers, and refugees from all over Europe were flooding the same roads in reverse. Amid this sea of people, figuring out who was who became both urgent and nearly impossible. The same questions were asked again and again. Which unit were you in? What rank? Where? And when? But the answers, honest or not, didn't always determine the outcome. Some were detained over a small inconsistency they couldn't explain. Others were released early simply because no one noticed their file. The differences between occupation zones made the idea of surrender relative. In one area, a man might be treated as a regular prisoner of war. Just a few dozen kilometers away, he could be labeled a war crimes suspect. Prisoner transfers between Allied forces happened with little explanation, and those being transferred rarely understood why. Trucks would leave camps filled with hope for release, only to arrive at a different camp, where the same questions were asked again, this time in a colder tone. In this environment, surrender no longer meant the end of military duty. It became a suspended state, where people existed in indefinite limbo, waiting for screening, waiting for interrogation, waiting for decisions. And during that waiting, a new awareness began to take shape. Identity was no longer a source of structure or pride. It had become a burden. Every time a name was called, a person wondered, will this name bring freedom, another camp, or something worse? Many realized that in this post-war world, survival depended not only on what they had done, but on what others believed about who they were. A uniform could seal one's fate. A badge forgotten in a coat pocket could be evidence of guilt, and at times, a lack of information was the greatest shield. Some were detained simply because their identity was too clear. Others slipped through early screenings thanks to the vagueness in their records. It was during this phase, when surrender had occurred but the future remained undefined, that a silent shift began. Not in conference rooms or at negotiation tables, but inside each individual mind. The question was no longer how to keep fighting, but how to survive in a new order where one's past could become a sentence. Stories were quietly rewritten, details were left out, memories were rearranged to attract as little attention as possible. For many, the time spent in temporary camps or holding zones felt like the longest period of their lives, not because of the days themselves, but the relentless tension. Every morning began with the same dread. Why will they call my name today? Every night ended with the question, will tomorrow be different? In that suspended state, notions of morality, responsibility, or the past were gradually eclipsed by a single priority: survive the next day. And from within that long wait, a new clarity began to form. Surrender had ended the war on paper, but it had launched a different race, a race against time, against records, and against one's own identity. As the temporary camps grew more organized, as investigations grew more thorough, staying who you were became the greatest risk of all. To survive long-term, many realized silence wasn't enough. They would need to disappear, carefully, thoroughly. It was at that moment, when surrender stopped being seen as an end and became a dangerous beginning, that the story entered a new chapter. A chapter where bullets were no longer the main threat, but memories, documents, and scars became the enemy. And in the shadows of post-war Europe, a quiet race began, a race to erase the past, sever all ties, and escape the name once bound to the downfall of an entire regime. After the uncertain days of surrender in prison camps and makeshift detention zones, many began to grasp a chilling truth. In the post-war world, the greatest danger wasn't hunger, cold, or disease. It was the past. The past didn't stay buried in memory. It lived on in records, in the testimonies of others, in the tiny details they themselves had forgotten they carried. And for those who had once worn the uniform of the Waffen-SS, that past resembled a sentence not yet passed. The effort to erase traces didn't begin with grand plans or underground networks. It started with instinctive, almost desperate acts. Insignias were ripped from collars and thrown into the mud. Small notebooks hastily filled during the war were torn to pieces and burned in quiet, hidden fires outside the camp. Military documents, once a source of pride, now became a direct threat. A single stamp, a signature, or a unit number could be enough to move a person from the line for release to the line for deep interrogation. But the more they tried to erase, the more they realized some traces couldn't be scrubbed away. Language was one of them. A way of speaking, a tone, a military vocabulary could betray someone within a few answers. Some learned to stay silent, only speaking when directly questioned, and offering as little detail as possible. Long, elaborate lies that seemed convincing were often the most dangerous traps. Simple, vague, colorless responses often fared better in an overloaded system running short on time. Then there was a mark that most feared more than any: the blood group tattoo under the left arm. For the Waffen-SS, it had been a technical detail used by medics to save lives on the battlefield. After May 1945, it became a death sentence in disguise. What seemed like a routine medical check could suddenly mean life or death. One glance under a sleeve by a doctor, and every lie, every denial could collapse in seconds. The responses to this risk revealed the full human tragedy of extreme conditions. Some tried to burn their own skin, leaving warped scars in hopes of hiding the tattoo. Others intentionally caused infections to deform the area. Some avoided medical checks at all costs, faking illness, requesting transfers before their turn came. And some, by luck or by having served in units that didn't use the tattoo, passed through the first screening without even knowing how close they'd come to exposure. The race against identity wasn't just waged on the body, it raged in the mind. People began editing their life stories like a dangerous manuscript. Dates and places were blurred, service periods shortened or rewritten as civilian labor. Some claimed they were cooks, warehouse clerks, logistics staff. Others said they were anti-aircraft crew or militia conscripts drafted in the final months. Truth was no longer measured by right or wrong, but by how verifiable it was. Inside the camps, these stories spread faster than official news. People learned from each other, how to answer, how to deflect, how to keep a neutral face when questioned about things best left unremembered. An underground community formed, not out of ideology or old comradeship, but out of a shared instinct to survive. There was no absolute trust. Everyone knew that under pressure, anyone could become a danger to someone else. Time didn't ease the fear, it transformed it. As interrogations became more systematic and records began to be cross-referenced, mere outward erasure was no longer enough. Those who once believed a few months of silence would lead to release now realized the longer they stayed, the higher the risk of being discovered. Each passing day increased the odds that a witness would emerge, a document surface, a minor discrepancy get flagged. It was in this realization that the line between passive concealment and active escape began to blur. At first, it was just a wish to be transferred to a different camp, a different occupation zone, where records weren't yet connected. Then came plans to slip out of controlled areas, into rural chaos where paperwork was still loose. And for some, the thought pushed one step further: leave Europe altogether. At first, it sounded absurd. Borders were tightly monitored, transport was disrupted, identity papers barely existed. But in the post-war world, where millions moved every month, chaos opened up unexpected cracks. Whispers began circulating in the camps about priests willing to help, about travel passes stamped with humanitarian emblems, about foggy port cities, where if your name matched the right document, you could board a ship. At first, they were just rumors, but rumors repeated often enough became hope. And hope in those conditions was a dangerous motivator. It made people willing to risk everything, willing to leave the fragile safety of captivity behind for a journey with no guarantees. The race against identity, then, no longer stopped at erasing the past. It became a search for a new road, a path that wasn't on official maps, not written in any orders, but that existed long enough to carry hundreds, even thousands, out from under the light of justice. From those scattered personal efforts, those first solitary steps to escape records and memory, a shadowy network began to take shape. Not in a day, not under a single name, but as a string of connections stretching across borders, monasteries, humanitarian offices, and fog-shrouded docks. That's when the race against identity left the realm of the individual and entered a new phase, where secret roads opened up, leading the hunted far from Europe, far from the past, and at times far beyond the reach of those who would come looking. When personal efforts to erase the past began to hit their limit, when silence and carefully edited life stories were no longer enough to escape the increasingly systematized investigations, another layer of reality slowly emerged. It wasn't drawn on military maps, nor announced in any orders or declarations by the victors. Yet it existed, operating steadily in the shadows of post-war Europe. People gave it a cold, evocative name: rat lines, narrow, winding escape routes, hidden like burrows, yet capable of leading fugitives very far from reach. Rat lines weren't born of any central command, nor were they the product of a single organization. They emerged from the overlap of chaos, compassion, political calculation, and personal relationships forged long before the war. Monasteries, churches, relief offices, and refugee housing became points of transit. There, identities were blurred, pasts compressed into lifeless lines on paper. And with the right stamp, the right signature, a person could step into a completely new life. Within this shadowy network, humanitarian organizations played a central and deeply paradoxical role. Documents issued by the International Committee of the Red Cross, intended to help millions of displaced people, POWs, and refugees reintegrate, became unintentional passports for those trying to flee justice. A new name, a vague birth date, a misspelled place of origin, each small detail could add up to unlock the way out of Europe. Italy and Austria became critical junctions in these escape routes, not due to open collusion, but because of geography and circumstance. Both countries were flooded with displaced persons, freed POWs, and homeless veterans. In such a sea of humanity, disappearing didn't require extraordinary skill. All it took was melting into the crowd at the right moment, leaving a camp on the right day, arriving at a monastery or hostel, whispered about in a passing conversation. There, people waited, not in sheer panic as before, but in a quiet, tense limbo where hope and risk coexisted. Some names would later surface in documents decades afterward, shadowy figures tied to these paths. Alois Hudal, an Austrian Catholic bishop, was among the most controversial, Under the guise of helping lost souls in a time of crisis, he facilitated paperwork and shelter for many former SS members. To Hudal, it was an act of faith and a stand against the rising tide of communism. To history, he was a key link in the chain that helped war criminals slip away from prosecution. Elsewhere in the network, Krunoslav Draganovich operated routes stretching from Central Europe to the Mediterranean. Trains, ports, obscure administrative offices, these were the final stops before ships departed. Their destinations were often whispered: Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, Syria, lands seeking labor, rebuilding, and asking few questions about the past, so long as the paperwork looked clean. Not everyone who stepped aboard those ships understood what lay ahead. Some believed they would reintegrate quickly, start over, live ordinary lives. Others knew they were entering a kind of permanent exile, where their old names could never be spoken aloud. But for all, the logic was the same. Staying behind meant escalating risk. Leaving was the only chance to close the book on their former lives. What made the rat lines so disturbing wasn't just that they worked, it was how they exploited the shifting priorities of the post-war world. As the Cold War began to take shape, the attention of major powers shifted rapidly. Yesterday's enemies were no longer the primary concern. New threats, new alliances, and new strategic calculations overshadowed individual prosecutions. In that context, hunting down former Waffen-SS members became an expensive, low-priority task, often delayed, sometimes quietly dropped. Rat lines, then, weren't just physical escape routes, they were products of a very specific historical moment. A moment when justice had to compete with politics, with fresh fears, with the need for rapid stability. Those who fled down these paths didn't vanish into thin air. They lived, they worked, they started families under new names. Some faded entirely into obscurity, others ironically thrived, earning respect in new communities. Their past buried deep beneath layers of time. But history rarely accepts eternal silence. No matter how far those roads stretched, no matter how many thousands of kilometers they carried a man, they couldn't sever every thread to the past. Forgotten records weren't destroyed. Silent witnesses didn't disappear. And as the decades passed and geopolitical priorities shifted once again, old questions began to resurface. For years, rat lines did the unthinkable. They delayed justice, but they didn't erase it. They only stretched the distance between act and consequence, between crime and reckoning. And it was that distance that shaped the great tragedy of the post-war era. Not that some escaped, but that the world took so long to begin searching for them. From those unmarked paths, the story entered its next chapter. The chapter of belated trials, where time itself became justice's greatest adversary, and every verdict echoed in the heavy silence of the years already gone. As the escape routes slowly closed and the world moved into a new era, it seemed for a while that the story was over. Europe rebuilt. Cities rose from the rubble. A new generation grew up among schools, factories, and economic recovery plans. War receded into the pages of textbooks. But beneath the surface, history refused to rest. It lingered in unfinished files, in unverified testimonies, and in the memories of those who had survived, both victims and perpetrators. In the immediate aftermath of the war, justice appeared with resolute clarity. The Nuremberg trials set an unprecedented standard. Individuals could be held criminally responsible for war crimes, even when acting under state authority. But that light did not shine evenly for long. As the Cold War shaped a new global order, priorities shifted rapidly. Complex trials requiring immense time and resources were quietly pushed aside. Many cases were shelved, not because the accused were innocent, but because it was not the right time. The 1950s passed in a silence that was anything but accidental. Governments sought stability, social reintegration, new alliances. In that climate, digging into the past became inconvenient. Many former Waffen-SS members lived openly under their real names, working in factories, offices, even local government. They were not celebrated, but they were not questioned either. During this time, history stood not on the side of justice, but on the side of forgetting. But forgetting is never a permanent state. From the late 1950s into the 1960s, a new wave began to rise. The generation that had directly experienced the war began to speak out, no longer willing to accept silence as the price of peace. Journalists, Young prosecutors and survivors of concentration camps started asking what happened to those directly responsible? Where did they go? Why has no one gone looking for them? In this context, figures like Simon Wiesenthal became symbols of the long, grueling fight against time. Without state power, without an army or a court of his own, Wiesenthal and others like him relied on files, memory, and an almost obsessive persistence. Each name was pieced together from fragments. Each address was tracked from half-forgotten rumors. Every lead was another race against age, because both witnesses and suspects were growing old. The trials reopened during this period carried a different tone than those of the immediate post-war years. Gone was the eruptive rage of the victors. Gone was the urgency of a world just emerging from catastrophe. In its place was the cold rigor of legal procedure, where every detail had to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And here, time became the greatest adversary. Documents had been lost, witnesses misremembered, memories had been worn thin by decades of silence. Some defendants entered the courtroom with snow-white hair, slow steps, and trembling hands. They no longer resembled the men captured in wartime photographs. That in itself created an unsettling moral paradox. How do you connect the frail figure before you with the monstrous crimes described in the files? For the victims, that connection had never been broken. But for society, the distance of time blurred the lines. Some trials ended in prison sentences, though often for only a few years. Others concluded with declarations of insufficient evidence. Some suspects died before sentencing. Others passed away during investigation, leaving prosecutors and survivors alike with a sense of incompletion. Each outcome raised the same quiet question: can justice delayed still be justice at all? After 1989, as Eastern European archives were unlocked, history pivoted once more. Documents long buried behind locked doors suddenly emerged. Lists of names, orders, detailed reports. Names thought lost to time were called back into light. Some cases were reopened for a second, even a third time. By then, many suspects were in their 80s or 90s. Fierce debate erupted. Should the very elderly still be prosecuted? To survivors of the camps and massacres, the question was offensive. Age did not erase action. Time did not ease pain. For them, every trial, no matter how delayed, was an acknowledgement that what had happened was real, and that the world, at last, was willing to confront its own darkness. But for others, especially younger generations with no living memory of the war, the emotions were more complex. They saw an old man in the dock and wondered whether punishment still held any deterrent power, or whether it had become only a symbol. That tension made this era one of the most difficult chapters in post-war justice. It was no longer a clear battle between good and evil, but a collision of memory and present, of personal accountability and collective fatigue. Every verdict, whether harsh or lenient, carried more symbolic weight than punitive. It served as a reminder that history does not end simply because we wish it to. Justice, in this case, did not race to catch up with time. It moved slowly, haltingly, and with many flaws. Yet in that slowness lay an uncomfortable truth, that the post-war world had chosen to move forward before it had fully faced what had happened. It took decades and a fading of other priorities before the old questions were finally asked with the seriousness they deserved. When the belated trials finally drew to a close, there was no sense of victory, no grand moment of catharsis. Only a heavy silence, in which each person had to ask themselves what they truly expected from justice. Perhaps the ultimate goal was not to punish every last one, but to acknowledge that responsibility exists, that crimes do not vanish simply because the criminals have grown old. And in that silence, history left an unspoken message. Time may slow justice, it may erode memory, but it does not have the right to declare innocence in humanity's name. War is often retold through clear milestones: the day the guns fired, the day of victory, the day of surrender. But when you look deeper, you begin to see those lines exist only on paper. In the reality of human life, war doesn't end so neatly. It lingers, seeping into memory, into fate, into the shadows the world would need decades of courage to finally confront. The story of the Waffen-SS after May 1945 isn't just a tale of a military force falling apart. It is the portrait of a belief system collapsing, and of people caught between two worlds, one that had died and another not yet ready to receive them. Some were punished swiftly without trial or sentence. Others vanished into the flood of displaced people, onto ships crossing oceans, into new names scrawled on unfamiliar documents, and some lived out their lives in silence, carrying the past like a stone too heavy to ever set down. What makes this story haunting isn't just who escaped or who was brought to justice, it's how the world responded in the aftermath. In the early post-war years, the need to move forward, to rebuild, to stabilize took precedence. Justice was delayed not because people didn't know what had happened, but because facing it was too painful, too complex, too inconvenient for the emerging world order. Those empty spaces didn't vanish. They were only covered up, waiting to be exposed again. When the late trials began, when old names were spoken aloud after decades of silence, there was no feeling of closure, no full relief for victims, no punishment proportionate to every crime. What remained was a heavier understanding that human justice has limits, and time does not always stand on the side of truth. Yet it is the act of continuing to search, to keep asking questions, that keeps history from sliding completely into forgetfulness. The shadows of war don't belong only to the defeated. They belong to the world that watched, that knew, and that chose silence more than once. They remind us that war doesn't end when the gunfire stops. It ends only when society has the courage to face its consequences, without evasion, without excuses, without editing memory to suit the comforts of the present. The moral voids that war leaves behind don't fill themselves. They require ongoing confrontation, generation by generation. And perhaps the most important question isn't why some escaped or why justice came late. The deeper question is, what have we learned from that delay? Is our collective memory strong enough to keep history from repeating itself, or will it fade, just like the forgotten case files once tucked away? History doesn't offer clear answers. It leaves us with stories, with traces, and with the responsibility that now rests on the shoulders of those who came after. If you've followed the story this far, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments on delayed justice, personal response to this, personal responsibility in collective tragedies, and how the post-war world has or hasn't faced its past. These diverse perspectives are what keep history illuminated from all sides, rather than sealed off in a single narrative. And if you value slow, multidimensional historical analysis, free from sensationalism or easy judgment, consider subscribing to History War. Every subscription not only helps the channel grow, but also ensures that history's hardest stories continue to be told with care, so the shadows of the past are not forgotten, and we can better understand our responsibilities in the present.